The fastest way to lose everything is to stop believing the only person who has never lied to you. I didn't understand those words until the night my husband ordered me to kneel in front of 300 perfectly dressed guests. Crystal chandeliers painted the ballroom in warm light while a string quartet played as though nothing extraordinary was happening. The scent of fresh lilies drifted through the room, mixing with expensive perfume and polished oak. Every conversation faded into silence when Garrett Holloway slowly rose from his chair at the center of the ballroom. My husband didn't need to raise his voice. He never did. People listened because they feared disappointing him more than they feared failure itself. His steel gray eyes found mine across the room, and for one impossible second, I hoped he would smile the way he used to during quiet Sunday mornings before life became nothing but meetings, secrets, and suspicion. Instead, he looked at me as though I were a stranger standing inside his home. "Kneel," he said. One word. Calm. Controlled. Absolute. 300 pairs of eyes turned toward me. I could hear glasses being set onto tables. Someone stopped breathing just long enough for the silence to feel heavier than the music. My fingers tightened around the small leather purse hanging from my shoulder. Inside it rested my folded white pharmacy apron, still carrying a faint stain from a shift that had ended only hours before. No one knew why I had rushed straight from work to this anniversary banquet. No one asked. They only waited to see whether the wife of Garrett Holloway would obey. My knees felt weak, but not because I was afraid. They trembled because I realized trust had already died before I entered the room. I searched Garrett's face for doubt, for hesitation, for anything that reminded me of the man who once promised he would always hear my side first. There was nothing. Only certainty. Someone whispered that justice had finally arrived. Another guest quietly murmured that betrayal deserved consequences. I wanted to laugh at how easily people believe stories they desperately wanted to be true. I had spent the last 48 hours protecting a secret that wasn't mine to reveal. I had promised someone I would stay silent no matter what it cost me. I never imagined that promise would cost my marriage. Slowly, I lowered myself until both knees touched the polished marble floor. The cold traveled through the fabric of my dress like winter settling into my bones. Garrett remained expressionless. "Apologize," he said. I looked around the ballroom. Familiar faces avoided my eyes. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked satisfied. Even Garrett's younger sister Diana stared at me with confusion instead of anger, as though she sensed something wasn't right but couldn't explain it. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced myself to breathe evenly. Pride was loud. Love was quiet. Tonight, only one of them would survive. "I'm sorry," I whispered. Though I wasn't apologizing for the accusation hanging over my head, I was apologizing for believing love could survive without trust. Garrett gave a single nod before turning away, convinced the matter was finished. But hidden inside my purse, beneath that folded pharmacy apron, rested a hospital receipt that would destroy every lie standing in that ballroom within 3 days. And by the time Garrett discovered it, there would be nothing left for either of us to return to. The applause came first. Quiet at the beginning. Hesitant. Then it spread across the ballroom like a wave until it sounded as though everyone had just witnessed justice instead of humiliation. I remained on the cold marble floor for another heartbeat before standing on my own without waiting for anyone to offer a hand. My dress was perfectly pressed. My hair had not moved. Only something inside me had broken, and no tailor in Manhattan could ever stitch that back together. I picked up my purse and walked toward the exit while conversation slowly returned behind me. Crystal glasses clinked together again. Laughter cautiously resurfaced. The orchestra continued playing as though the evening had simply paused for an announcement. I realized then how easily life moved forward for people who were not the ones bleeding inside. Outside, the autumn air felt sharper than it had an hour earlier. The valet hurried toward me with my sedan, avoiding eye contact. I thanked him anyway. Kindness cost nothing, even on nights when everything else did. My phone vibrated before I reached the driver's seat. It was my younger brother, Miles. I stared at his name until the ringing stopped. 30 seconds later he called again. This time I answered. His voice sounded exhausted. "How did it go?" he asked quietly. I looked back at the ballroom windows glowing against the dark sky. "Exactly the way it needed to," I replied. He fell silent because he knew I was lying. He had always known when I was protecting someone. You do not have to keep carrying this alone, he whispered. I closed my eyes. I made a promise. And what if that promise destroys your life? I rested my forehead against the steering wheel. Then at least someone else gets to keep theirs. Another silence settled between us before he spoke again. The doctors called this afternoon. My fingers tightened around the phone. They said everything is stable for now. Relief washed over me so suddenly that tears finally reached my eyes, but I wiped them away before they could fall. No one had noticed the hospital receipt hidden beneath my pharmacy apron because no one had bothered asking where I had spent the previous night. They had all been too busy deciding what kind of woman I was. I drove home through quiet streets where neighborhood diners were closing and families carried leftovers to their cars. Ordinary lives continued around me. A father laughed with his little girl outside an ice cream shop. An elderly couple held hands while waiting for the traffic light to change. I wondered when Garrett and I had stopped living like ordinary people and started measuring love through suspicion instead of trust. When I opened the front door of our house, the silence felt unfamiliar. The staff had already retired for the night. I climbed the staircase slowly, entered our bedroom, and found Garrett's side untouched. He had not come home. His watch box remained open on the dresser beside the old silver pocket watch he inherited from his father. Whenever he doubted someone, he would absent-mindedly turn that watch in his palm until he convinced himself the facts mattered more than feelings. Tonight he had chosen facts that were never true. I removed my wedding ring and placed it beside the pocket watch. Then I slid the folded hospital receipt underneath it, not as revenge but as a quiet truth waiting for the right pair of eyes. I packed one small suitcase with clothes, my pharmacy license, my father's worn fountain pen, and the white apron that still carried a faded stain from the longest night of my life. Before closing the bedroom door for the last time, I whispered words Garrett was not there to hear. I hope someday the truth finds you before regret does. Then I walked away, unaware that before sunrise someone else would enter that empty room searching for something Garrett had never thought to question. Morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Garrett's office, turning the city into polished glass and gold, but he barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on the stack of reports spread across his desk. Every page confirmed exactly what he believed. Anonymous transfers, suspicious messages, carefully selected photographs that seemed impossible to argue with. Nathan Briggs stood quietly across the room, watching Garrett read the same paragraph for the third time. Your schedule begins in 15 minutes. Nathan reminded him. Garrett nodded without looking up. Reschedule the first meeting. You never reschedule. I am today. Nathan hesitated before placing a small envelope on the desk. Housekeeping found this in the master bedroom. Garrett reached for it almost absent-mindedly. Inside was a simple note written in Naomi's careful handwriting. There were only 4 words. Take care of yourself. Nothing else. No accusación. No explanación. No request to be forgiven. Garrett frowned. He had expected anger. Silence unsettled him far more. He leaned back in his chair and instinctively reached for his father's silver pocket watch, rolling it across his fingers exactly as he had done since childhood whenever doubt crept into his thoughts. His father used to tell him that feelings clouded judgment but evidence never did. Garrett had built his entire life around that lesson. He convinced himself Naomi would return after a few days, once emotions cooled and reality settled in. She always believed people deserved another chance. That belief had once been the thing he admired most about her. Now he quietly wondered if he had mistaken kindness for deception. By late afternoon he finally returned to the house. Everything appeared perfectly organized, almost untouched, except for one detail that immediately caught his attention. The hallway table where Naomi always left her car keys was empty. Her favorite wool coat was gone. The coffee mug she used every morning had been washed and carefully placed upside down on the drying rack. Margaret Sloane, the longtime housekeeper, approached him with hesitant steps. Mrs. Holloway packed only one suitcase, she said softly. Garrett loosened his tie. Did she tell you where she was going? Margaret slowly shook her head. No, sir. She thanked every member of the staff before she left. Garrett looked toward the front door. Thanked them. Margaret lowered her eyes. She said everyone had always been kind to her. Something about that sentence lingered longer than he expected. Naomi had not left in anger. She had left as though she did not intend to return. Garrett pushed the thought away. She will come back, he said, sounding more certain than he felt. Margaret did not answer. That evening Diana arrived unexpectedly carrying a folder against her chest. I need to ask you something, she said before even taking off her coat. Garrett motioned toward the sitting room. If this is about Naomi, the matter is already settled. Diana remained standing. That is exactly what worries me. Garrett looked at his sister. What do you mean? She slowly opened the folder and removed a copy of the guest list from the banquet. Because according to the timeline, Naomi could not have been in two places at once. Garrett frowned. Explain. Diana pointed toward a handwritten note attached to the list. Someone from St. Matthew Medical Center called looking for her during the reception. They insisted it was urgent. The nurse said Naomi had been there almost the entire previous night. Garrett stared at the paper without speaking. It was only one sentence. Only one inconsistency. Yet for the first time since the banquet, a tiny crack appeared in the certainty he had been holding onto so tightly. He reached for his pocket watch again, but this time the familiar weight in his hand no longer brought comfort. It only reminded him that every decision he had made rested on evidence someone else had placed in front of him, and somewhere beyond the walls of his silent house, Naomi was carrying a truth he had never once stopped to ask her about. The next morning refused to bring answers. Instead, it delivered questions Garrett had never expected to ask. He arrived at St. Matthew Medical Center just after sunrise, dressed in the same tailored charcoal suit that usually opened every locked door without resistance. Today it only earned polite smiles from nurses who were too busy beginning another 12-hour shift to care about reputation. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the lobby alongside disinfectant, and the quiet rhythm of rolling carts. Ordinary life moved around him with remarkable indifference. He approached the reception desk and showed his identification. I am looking for information about my wife, Naomi Holloway. The receptionist offered an apologetic smile. I am sorry, sir. I cannot discuss patient records without authorization. Garrett nodded. Normally he would have accepted the answer and left, but something inside him refused to walk away. Before he could speak again, a familiar voice interrupted from the hallway. Mr. Holloway? He turned to find Dr. Owen Pierce approaching with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. Garrett recognized him immediately from several charity events Naomi had persuaded him to support over the years. Dr. Pierce, Garrett replied. I need to ask you about my wife. The doctor's expression softened with genuine surprise. Naomi? Is she all right? Garrett hesitated. I was hoping you could answer that. The doctor studied his face for a long moment before quietly saying, I assume she told you everything. Those words landed with unexpected weight. Everything about what? Doctor. Pierce glanced toward the busy nurses' station, then motioned toward a quieter seating area beside a large window overlooking the hospital garden. Children laughed outside while volunteers planted autumn flowers beneath bright morning sunlight. The peaceful scene felt strangely out of place beside the growing tension in Garrett's chest. The doctor sat down slowly. Your wife has spent months helping a patient here. Garrett frowned. Months. Every week. Usually after finishing long shifts at the pharmacy. Sometimes she stayed until 2 or 3 in the morning. Garrett felt his heartbeat slow instead of quicken, the way it always did whenever his mind struggled to fit new facts into an old conclusion. Who was she helping? Dr. Pierce smiled gently. That is not my story to tell. Garrett looked away in frustration. Then why tell me any of this? The doctor's answer came without hesitation. Because I watched a woman exhaust herself trying to protect someone she loved, and I cannot reconcile that person with the accusations I heard whispered 3 nights ago. Silence settled between them. Garrett remembered every headline, every photograph, every report that had convinced him Naomi had betrayed him. Until now, none of them included this hospital. None of them mentioned sleepless nights or volunteer hours or promises quietly kept without recognition. As Garrett stood to leave, Dr. Pierce called after him. There is one more thing. Garrett turned back. The doctor reached into his clipboard and removed a folded visitor log. Hospital policy requires signatures. Garrett unfolded the page. Naomi's name appeared again and again across several months, always arriving late at night and leaving shortly before sunrise. But one entry made him stop breathing for a moment. The date matched the night before the banquet. Her departure time was only 43 minutes before she walked into the ballroom where he had accused her of betrayal. Garrett stared at the ink until the letters blurred together. He had believed she spent that night plotting against him. Instead, she had come directly from the hospital carrying exhaustion no one bothered to notice. As he folded the paper back together, another realization quietly settled into his mind. If Naomi had been exactly where the records proved she was, then someone else had carefully arranged every piece of evidence that convinced him she had been somewhere entirely different. Garrett drove back to his office with the visitor log resting on the passenger seat as though it weighed 100 pounds instead of a few sheets of paper. Every traffic light seemed longer than usual. Every minute gave his mind another chance to replay the banquet from beginning to end. He could still hear Naomi's quiet apology. He remembered how she never once argued, never begged, never defended herself. At the time, he had mistaken her silence for guilt. Now it felt dangerously close to sacrifice. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, and Nathan Briggs was already waiting outside the conference room with a laptop tucked beneath his arm. One look at Garrett's face told him something had changed. "What happened?" Nathan asked. Garrett handed him the hospital visitor log without saying a word. Nathan studied the dates carefully, then looked back up. These records placed Naomi at St. Matthew Medical Center almost the entire night before the banquet. Garrett nodded once. "I want every piece of digital evidence reviewed from the beginning." Nathan hesitated. Everything. Everything. Within the hour, the security team had gathered inside the media room. Multiple monitors illuminated the dark space while archived surveillance footage loaded frame by frame. Garrett stood with folded arms as technicians replayed recordings from the banquet venue, nearby parking garages, building entrances, and surrounding streets. At first nothing seemed unusual. Guests arrived. Valets parked luxury cars. Catering staff carried trays through service entrances. Then one technician paused the footage. "Sir, there is a timestamp discrepancy." Garrett stepped closer. "Show me." The technician enlarged two synchronized camera feeds. According to one recording, Naomi entered the ballroom at exactly 7:14 in the evening. Another camera placed her walking through the main hallway almost 6 minutes earlier than the first recording suggested. Nathan frowned. That is impossible unless one of these files was altered. Garrett felt a cold pressure settle across his chest. "Verify it." The technician began comparing digital signatures buried inside the original files. Several tense minutes passed in complete silence except for the clicking of keyboards. Finally, the technician slowly removed his glasses. "Someone edited the master recording before it reached our archive." Garrett did not speak. "The changes are subtle," the technician continued. "Only a few minutes here and there. Enough to create a false sequence without drawing attention." Nathan looked toward Garrett. If the timeline was manipulated, then every conclusion based on that footage becomes unreliable. Garrett closed his eyes for a brief moment. His entire judgment had rested upon evidence he believed was unquestionable. He remembered accusing Naomi without allowing her to explain. He remembered believing that certainty was the same thing as truth. Now certainty felt frighteningly fragile. "Can you identify who accessed the files?" Garrett asked. The technician typed another series of commands before the access history appeared on the largest screen. Several authorized names scrolled past until one account appeared only hours before the banquet. Nathan quietly read the name aloud. Elias Cross. The room fell silent again. Garrett stared at the screen without blinking. Elias had personally delivered the surveillance package that convinced everyone Naomi had betrayed the family. At the time it had seemed like loyalty. Now it looked like preparation. Nathan slowly closed his laptop. "Someone wanted you to reach exactly one conclusion." Garrett turned toward the window overlooking the city. For the first time in years, he realized the greatest danger had not come from an enemy standing across the table. It had come from the confidence with which he believed he could never be deceived, and somewhere beyond the skyline, Naomi still carried the burden of his mistake while the first thread of a much larger deception had finally begun to unravel. The city looked unchanged from the top floor of Holloway Tower, yet Garrett could no longer trust what he thought he saw. For years he had believed that certainty was strength, but every answer he uncovered seemed to erase another piece of confidence. Nathan placed a thin folder on the conference table without saying a word. Inside were copies of pharmacy schedules, volunteer records, and hospital visitor logs collected over the previous 24 hours. They all told the same quiet story. Naomi had finished full shifts at the neighborhood pharmacy before driving across town to St. Matthew Medical Center, returning home only a few hours before sunrise. She had repeated that routine for months without mentioning it to anyone inside the Holloway household. Garrett traced her signature with his fingertip. The neat handwriting looked exactly the same on every page, steady and patient, as though she had never expected anyone to notice. Diana stepped into the room carrying a paper coffee cup and a small envelope. Her expression was softer than it had been since the banquet. "Margaret found this tucked inside one of Naomi's recipe books," she said. Garrett opened the envelope carefully. A faded photograph slipped onto the table. It showed Naomi wearing her white pharmacy coat beside a smiling teenage boy, whose arm rested across her shoulders. They both looked exhausted, yet genuinely happy. Written on the back in blue ink were the words, "One more treatment completed. Keep believing." Garrett looked up. "Who is he?" Diana slowly shook her head. "I do not know, but Margaret remembers Naomi receiving calls from the hospital long before any of us realized she was volunteering there." Garrett remembered the nights Naomi returned home after midnight claiming she had stayed late to help with inventory. He had accepted the explanation without asking another question because work had always seemed like the simplest answer. Now he wondered how many opportunities he had missed to truly know the woman he married. Nathan broke the silence. "We also reviewed the financial records." Garrett turned toward him. "Did you find anything?" "Nothing that supports the accusations made against Naomi. In fact, several anonymous donations to the hospital came from an account registered only to her." Garrett frowned. She never mentioned making donations. Nathan closed the folder. "It appears she was paying for someone else's treatment." The room grew quiet again. Garrett stared through the office window as afternoon sunlight reflected across the river below. Every discovery painted the same picture. Naomi had not been hiding betrayal. She had been hiding compassion. He suddenly remembered how she always carried the worn leather purse with her, never allowing anyone else to move it. At the time he assumed it contained work supplies. Now he wondered what promises, receipts, and private burdens had traveled with her every day while he remained too distracted to ask. His phone vibrated across the table. The caller identification displayed a number he did not recognize. Garrett answered. A calm female voice spoke first. "Mr. Holloway, this is the pharmacy where Naomi worked. We found something she asked us to give you if you ever came looking for the truth." Garrett closed his eyes for a brief moment before replying, "I am on my way." As the call ended, he realized this would be the first time in years that he was not chasing evidence to confirm what he already believed. He was searching because he finally accepted that he had been wrong. The neighborhood pharmacy sat between a family bakery and a laundromat that had probably looked the same for 30 years. Garrett parked across the street and remained inside his car for several moments, watching ordinary people come and go with paper prescription bags tucked beneath their arms. Naomi had spent countless evenings here after leaving the hospital, surrounded by people who knew nothing about the Holloway name and cared even less. Inside, the soft scent of fresh coffee mixed with antiseptic. Shelves were neatly arranged, and a small handwritten sign near the register reminded customers to be kind, because everyone was carrying something invisible. Garrett found himself reading that sentence twice. A middle-aged pharmacist approached with a gentle smile. "Mr. Holloway?" Garrett nodded. "You called me." She reached beneath the counter and carefully placed a small cardboard box in front of him. "Naomi asked us to keep this if she ever stopped coming to work. She said that if you arrived looking for answers instead of excuses, we should give it to you." Garrett swallowed hard before opening the lid. Inside lay the neatly folded white pharmacy apron he remembered seeing every morning beside their kitchen table. Beneath it rested a stack of hospital parking receipts, several handwritten notes, and a sealed envelope with his name written in Naomi's unmistakable handwriting. His hands hesitated before breaking the seal. The letter was short. Garrett, if you are reading this, it means you finally decided to ask questions instead of assuming you already knew the answers. I do not blame you for doubting me. Fear has a way of sounding like certainty. I only wish you had trusted the woman you married long enough to let me speak. There is someone who needed my silence more than I needed to defend myself. I chose to protect that promise because some lives cannot survive public attention. One day I hope you understand that keeping a secret is not the same as telling a lie. Please do not look for me until you are searching because you understand, not because you feel guilty. Garrett lowered the letter slowly. The pharmacist quietly placed one more document beside the box. It was an invoice showing monthly payments for ongoing medical treatment. Every payment had been made from Naomi's personal savings. She never missed one, the pharmacist said softly, even after working double shifts. Garrett looked up. Do you know who she was helping? The pharmacist smiled sadly. I promised Naomi I would never reveal that without permission. She believed protecting someone else's dignity mattered more than receiving credit. Garrett closed his eyes. That answer sounded exactly like the woman he had failed to recognize. As he gathered the papers, his attention settled on one final item hidden beneath the apron. It was an old fountain pen with worn silver trim. He immediately recognized it as the pen Naomi's late father had given her before college. Wrapped around it was a small slip of paper that simply read, "Truth arrives quietly. Regret never does." Garrett slipped the pen into his jacket pocket with unusual care. For years he had measured loyalty through evidence collected in files and reports. Naomi had measured it through quiet sacrifices no report would ever capture. As he stepped back onto the sidewalk, the afternoon breeze carried the distant laughter of children leaving school, and for the first time since the banquet, Garrett understood that the greatest proof of Naomi's innocence had never been hidden inside surveillance footage or financial records. It had been hidden inside the ordinary life she continued living every single day while expecting nothing in return. The drive home felt longer than it ever had before, even though every traffic light seemed determined to let Garrett pass without stopping. The cardboard box rested on the passenger seat beside Naomi's letter, and every few minutes his eyes drifted toward it as though the words inside might somehow change if he looked again. They did not. They only settled deeper into his conscience. When he stepped through the front door of the Holloway estate, the house felt unusually quiet. The silence was no longer comforting. It sounded like absence. Margaret was arranging fresh flowers in the foyer when she noticed him carrying the worn pharmacy apron folded over one arm. Her hands froze. She never let that out of her sight, she whispered. Garrett nodded. I know. Margaret looked at him for a long moment before speaking again. Mrs. Holloway used to come home after midnight smelling like coffee and antiseptic. I asked her once why she worked so hard when she did not have to. She smiled and told me that having the ability to help someone meant she no longer had the excuse not to. Garrett lowered his eyes. He remembered complaining that she was exhausting herself. He had never asked who she was trying to save. Upstairs, he entered the bedroom they had shared for almost 4 years. Everything remained exactly as Naomi had left it. Her favorite novel still rested on the nightstand with a bookmark halfway through the final chapter. A knitted sweater hung neatly over the chair by the window. The lavender candle she always lit before reading had burned down to a thin ring of wax. The room looked less like someone had moved away, and more like someone expected to return after work. That illusion lasted only a second. Garrett opened her closet. Most of her clothes were gone, but one small storage box remained on the highest shelf. Inside he found greeting cards from neighbors, thank you notes from hospital fundraisers, and dozens of handwritten reminders. Buy groceries for Margaret. Call Miles after treatment. Pick up medicine for Mrs. Alvarez next door. None of the notes mention wealth, status, or social events. They were ordinary reminders belonging to an ordinary woman who quietly carried other people's burdens without asking for recognition. A folded newspaper clipping slipped from between the papers. It featured a photograph of a community blood drive held nearly a year earlier. Naomi stood in the back row wearing her pharmacy apron, smiling beside volunteers from St. Matthew Medical Center. Garrett studied the date beneath the picture. It matched a weekend he distinctly remembered accusing her of choosing work over spending time with him. The memory returned with painful clarity. She had apologized. He had accepted the apology without asking where she had actually been. Downstairs, Nathan arrived carrying another report. "We traced Elias Cross's access to the security archive," he said. "He was not acting alone, but we still do not know his full objective." Garrett looked up from the newspaper clipping. "Keep investigating." Nathan hesitated. "There is something else. We located Miles Whitaker." Garrett immediately stood. "Where is he?" "He recently transferred to a rehabilitation center along the coast. Naomi has been visiting him regularly under a different mailing address." Garrett closed his eyes as every piece slowly connected. The hospital visits. The anonymous payments. The promises she refused to break. She had not disappeared to escape responsibility. She had disappeared to continue protecting her family exactly as she always had. For the first time in his life, Garrett realized the strongest person he had ever known had never needed power to prove her strength. She had carried it quietly, one ordinary day after another, while he had been too blinded by suspicion to recognize the extraordinary heart standing beside him. Garrett left the estate before sunrise with nothing more than Naomi's letter, the worn fountain pen, and a folded map Nathan had marked with the address of the rehabilitation center near the coast. The highway stretched for miles beneath a pale gray sky, and for the first time in years he drove without taking a single business call. Every mile carried him farther from the world where every problem could be solved with authority, and closer to the quiet life Naomi had chosen long before she walked away. The rehabilitation center overlooked a calm bay where fishing boats drifted slowly across the morning water. It was modest, clean, and peaceful. Nothing like the luxury facilities Garrett had always assumed people preferred. Inside, the scent of fresh coffee mixed with ocean air drifting through open windows. A receptionist greeted him with a warm smile before politely asking his reason for visiting. "I am looking for Miles Whitaker," Garrett answered. She checked the schedule and nodded. "He is in physical therapy, but visiting hours begin in 20 minutes. Garrett thanked her and sat near a window facing the water. Families spoke quietly around him. A little girl handed a handmade drawing to her grandfather. A volunteer adjusted a vase filled with fresh wildflowers. The simple kindness surrounding him reminded him of the notes Naomi had left behind, each one centered on helping someone else instead of herself. When the therapy room doors finally opened, Garrett immediately recognized Miles. He looked healthier than the photograph Garrett had found, though the months of treatment had left traces of exhaustion around his eyes. Miles stopped walking the instant he noticed Garrett standing nearby. Neither man spoke for several seconds. "You found me," Miles finally said. Garrett nodded. "I was looking for Naomi." Miles studied him carefully before answering. "You should have started looking for the truth first." Garrett lowered his eyes. "I know." They walked outside toward a wooden bench overlooking the bay. Seagulls circled overhead while waves rolled gently against the docks below. Garrett removed Naomi's letter from his jacket but kept it folded in his hand. "She paid for your treatment," he said quietly. Miles smiled with quiet pride. "She did much more than that. She convinced me that asking for help was not weakness." Garrett looked toward the water. "Why did she never tell me?" Miles leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because I asked her not to. I was ashamed. I did not want anyone connected to your world to see me as a burden. She respected that, even when it meant carrying the secret alone." Garrett closed his eyes briefly. Every answer uncovered another sacrifice Naomi had made without asking for recognition. "Do you know where she is now?" he asked. Miles remained silent long enough that Garrett accepted he might never receive an answer. Then Miles reached into his pocket and handed him a folded receipt from a small bookstore and cafe in a quiet coastal town several hours farther south. "She volunteers there on weekends," he said. "If you go, do not expect forgiveness. Just be honest for the first time." Garrett carefully folded the receipt beside Naomi's letter. As he stood to leave, Miles called after him one final time. "She never stopped loving you. She simply stopped believing you could see her." Those words followed Garrett all the way back to his car, heavier than any accusation he had ever carried, because he finally understood that rebuilding trust would require far more than finding Naomi. It would require becoming the kind of man she had believed he could be. The coastal town appeared almost untouched by time. Narrow streets lined with family-owned shops led toward the harbor where fishing boats rocked gently against weathered wooden docks. Garrett parked across from the bookstore and cafe listed on the receipt Miles had given him. The sign above the entrance had faded from years of salt air, and flower boxes overflowed with late autumn blooms. It was the kind of place Naomi would have loved long before she ever met him. He stepped inside. Shelves filled with well-worn novels surrounded a handful of wooden tables where people quietly read over coffee. Soft music drifted through the room, blending with the sound of waves outside. A young employee greeted him with an easy smile. "Can I help you find something?" Garrett glanced around the room. "I am looking for Naomi Whitaker." The employee's expression shifted ever so slightly before she answered. "She volunteers here, but she is not working today." Garrett nodded, trying not to let disappointment show. "Do you know when she will be back?" Before the young woman could answer, an older gentleman emerged from a back office carrying a stack of donated books. He studied Garrett for a moment, then set the books on the counter. "You must be Garrett." The words caught him by surprise. "You know who I am?" The man smiled kindly. "Naomi never spoke badly about you. She only said that one day you might come looking for answers instead of arguments." Garrett lowered his eyes. She was right. The older man introduced himself as Samuel Brooks, the bookstore owner. He invited Garrett to sit near the window overlooking the harbor and poured 2 cups of coffee without asking what he preferred. "She comes here every Saturday," Samuel said. "She reads to children whose parents work the fishing boats. Sometimes she helps older residents fill out medical paperwork, because they trust her more than computers." Garrett listened in silence. Every sentence described another quiet act of kindness that Naomi had never mentioned. Samuel reached beneath the counter and retrieved a small canvas tote bag. "She accidentally left this here last weekend." Garrett recognized it immediately. It was the same simple bag Naomi had carried to the pharmacy for years. Samuel handed it to him. Inside were library cards, children's drawings, a paperback novel with folded pages, and a small notebook filled with neatly written reminders. Garrett carefully turned each page. Most entries listed medicine schedules for elderly neighbors, birthdays of local children, grocery requests from people who could no longer drive, and encouraging quotes she planned to share during volunteer reading sessions. Near the back of the notebook he found a single page written only a few days earlier. It read, "Healing begins the moment someone chooses to listen instead of assuming they already know the whole story." Garrett closed the notebook slowly. Samuel looked toward the harbor before speaking again. "Naomi once told me that trust is built quietly over years, but can disappear in a single afternoon." She never sounded angry, only sad. Garrett felt the weight of those words settle inside him. He had spent years believing leadership meant making quick decisions with complete confidence. Naomi had lived by a different rule entirely. She listened first. She judged last. As Garrett stood to leave, Samuel handed him a folded piece of paper. "She asked me to give you this only if you came here alone." Garrett unfolded it carefully. It contained nothing but a simple address written in Naomi's handwriting, and one short sentence beneath it. "If you come here, come without your title, without your pride, and without expecting the past to disappear." Garrett looked toward the quiet road leading away from the harbor. For the first time since beginning his search, he realized he was no longer trying to recover the life he had lost. He was preparing to face the woman he had finally begun to understand. The address Naomi had written led Garrett to a quiet neighborhood perched above the shoreline, where modest white cottages overlooked the sea instead of the city skyline he had always called home. Children rode bicycles along the narrow streets while neighbors greeted one another by name. No one glanced twice at the expensive sedan parked beneath an old maple tree. In this place, reputation carried far less weight than kindness. Garrett walked slowly toward the small cottage marked with blue shutters and a porch lined with potted herbs. The scent of rosemary drifted through the cool afternoon air. Before he could knock, the front door opened. Naomi stood there wearing a simple cream-colored sweater and faded jeans, her hair loosely tied back exactly the way she always wore it after long shifts at the pharmacy. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Months of shared memories filled the silence more completely than words ever could. Garrett noticed the familiar fountain pen resting in his jacket pocket and wondered whether he deserved to carry it. Naomi looked at him with calm eyes that no longer searched for his approval. She simply waited. "I found your letter," Garrett said quietly. She nodded once. "I thought you might." He lowered his gaze. "Everything I believed was wrong." Naomi stepped aside just enough to leave the doorway open but made no invitation for him to enter. "Knowing that does not change what happened." Her voice remained gentle, but every word carried quiet certainty. Garrett accepted the truth without argument. "You are right." She folded her arms lightly against the cool breeze. "Do you know what hurt the most?" He slowly shook his head. "It was not standing in front of those people. It was realizing that you had already decided who I was before asking me a single question." Garrett closed his eyes for a moment. There was no defense for that. "I trusted evidence more than I trusted you." Naomi looked toward the ocean beyond the porch. "Evidence tells you what happened. Trust tells you who someone is. You forgot the difference." A gull drifted across the pale afternoon sky while waves rolled steadily against the rocks below. The peaceful rhythm of the sea only made Garrett's regret feel louder. "I came to apologize," he said. Naomi met his eyes again. "I believe that." The words surprised him, but she continued before hope could settle inside him. "Believing an apology is sincere is not the same as being ready to live inside the same life again." Garrett nodded slowly. "I understand." She smiled sadly. "Do you?" "Because forgiveness is not a switch. It is something that grows only where safety exists. I no longer know what safety feels like beside you." Her honesty pierced more deeply than anger ever could have. Garrett reached into his jacket and carefully removed the silver pocket watch that had belonged to his father. For years it had reminded him to trust facts above feelings. He placed it gently on the porch railing between them. "I carried this every day because I thought it made me stronger," he said. "Now it only reminds me of the mistake that cost me the person I loved most." Naomi looked at the watch but did not touch it. Instead, she glanced toward the small community garden beside the cottage where children were watering flowers with bright plastic cans. "Strength is not refusing to be wrong," she said softly. "Strength is becoming someone who is willing to listen before deciding another person's worth." Garrett felt those words settle inside him with quiet permanence. For the first time since their lives had fallen apart, he realized he had not come to win Naomi back. He had come to become the man she had believed he could be long before either of them understood how fragile trust truly was. Winter arrived quietly along the coast. The bookstore and cafe remained warm with the familiar scent of coffee, old paper, and fresh bread drifting through the wooden rooms every morning. Naomi had settled into a life that no longer depended on anyone's approval. She worked several days each week at the local pharmacy, volunteered at the bookstore on weekends, and spent every Wednesday evening reading to children from fishing families whose parents often returned home long after sunset. Her life had become wonderfully ordinary, and for the first time in years ordinary felt like peace. Garrett never returned to ask for another chance. He honored the only request Naomi had made. Instead of chasing forgiveness, he began changing the life he had built. Nathan quietly informed Diana that Garrett had transferred control of several business interests, expanded funding for community health programs, and established a permanent scholarship for pharmacy students who planned to serve small towns instead of wealthy neighborhoods. None of the programs carried his family name. He insisted they remain anonymous. Months passed before Naomi heard any of it, and when she did, she simply smiled before returning to organize children's books for the afternoon reading group. She understood the difference between a grand gesture and a lasting change. One rainy Saturday, Samuel handed her a small package that had arrived without a return address. Inside rested the silver pocket watch Garrett had left behind, but it looked different now. The old engraving on the inside cover had been carefully replaced. Where it once carried his father's words about trusting facts above feelings, it now held a single sentence engraved in simple lettering. "Listen before you decide." Naomi traced the words with her thumb and closed the watch without speaking. There was no letter, no request, no apology repeated for the 100th time. Only a quiet acknowledgement of the lesson that had changed both of their lives. A few weeks later, Garrett happened to walk past the bookstore while delivering supplies for a community fundraiser. He noticed Naomi through the front window, laughing with a group of children gathered around a table covered with colored pencils and picture books. He stopped for only a moment. Their eyes met through the glass. Neither of them waved. Neither of them crossed the street. Yet there was no bitterness left between them. Only gratitude for the people they had become after surviving the hardest chapter of their lives. Garrett smiled gently before continuing down the sidewalk, carrying boxes instead of expectations. Naomi watched him disappear around the corner, then returned to the children waiting for the next page of the story. Years earlier, she would have mistaken that ending for heartbreak. Now she understood it as healing. Some love stories are not measured by whether two people remain together forever. Some are measured by whether they leave each other better than they were before. Garrett had once believed power meant being right. Naomi had quietly shown him that true strength begins the moment a person becomes willing to listen, to learn, and to admit they were wrong. And although their paths no longer followed the same road, the lesson they shared would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Because trust is never protected by pride, love is never sustained by certainty alone, and sometimes the greatest victory is not getting back what was lost, but becoming someone worthy of protecting what remains. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who believes that forgiveness is earned, trust is fragile, and true love is measured by the courage to change. Leave a comment below and tell us, could you ever forgive someone who publicly humiliated you if they truly changed afterward? Your thoughts may inspire the next story we tell. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next Mafia Sweet Love Story.